Hello everybody and welcome to Beaver Hunter Scale Models. This video is about painting figures the quick paint way without using quick paints, but classic acrylics, because I am too stingy to buy new paints and products every time something new hits the market. So, if you are curious how I made it and if I was successful, please stay tuned. I made this diorama some time ago and I felt it was still too empty. So it was time again to paint some figures to fill it up. And these US paratroopers and a French resistance or resistance fighter by Dynamo models are the figures this video is about. The figures are printed and amazing in quality and included package contents like all the extra accessories like 2 heads, pistols, trenching tools, first aid kits and so on and so on. I let them sit in almost hot water for a few minutes so the resin got more flexible and I could easily remove the pieces from the supports. But it's never a bad idea to have some sharp cutters at hand when supports sit on small or fragile parts. And with some patience, releasing the figures was done pretty fast and I was rewarded with figures with perfect fit and without any gap filling. I like to glue in place as much accessories as possible before painting, because I really hated to handle with super glue on painted stuff. So shovels, canteens and pistols were glued in place. A cool detail were the included chin straps, and for the same reason I glued them in place already. The Thompson MP was the trickiest part because there were no belts designed or implied at the position where it was supposed to sit. So I came up with this solution, a fake belt made from lead foil and some leftover PE eyelets, which I then glued in place as if the belt was running under his arm. Of course, I knew that painting the areas behind the Thompson will be a nightmare, but again, gluing this thing in place after painting wasn't an option for me because of the earlier mentioned reasons. After placing the figures on corks and all loose parts onto something, I gave them a generous cleaning in soapy water and blew them dry with my airbrush. And that's the whole parade on their professional painting handles, ready to be degreased. For that I used Modeler's World degreaser. Whenever I can, I like to do this by brush because I want to use the effect of mechanical cleaning. This stuff could be used by airbrush too, but I only do it like this when there are fragile PE parts on a tank, for example. So I gave every figure, heads and all remaining parts a generous cleaning with the degreaser, what not only cleans the figure, it also somehow seems to roughen the smooth surface of the resin, and that can't be a bad thing. Priming. I finally managed to get myself a bottle of black Mr. Surfacer, so I could skip the step with the brown Mr. Surfacer and then spraying the figures black. This black coat was needed as a foundation for the pre-shading, and I made sure to hit every deeper spot that would be darker because of created shadows. Of course, all heads and other parts were also primed with the black Mr. Surfacer. For the lighter counterpart of the pre-shading, I used pure white this time, because I needed a strong contrast for what I had planned. So like usual, I sprayed the white in a flat angle from above, so only the raised areas were hit. But this not only emphasized the raised areas, it also worked out the contours and highlighted details. The figures look way better and more three-dimensional after this step, and I really like the look. For both steps, the priming and highlighting, I used my Gaahleri Aventus with a 0.2 nozzle to have full control over the amount of the applied paint. Okay, let's pretend no one saw that. And of course, all heads were sprayed this way and all other parts like weapons and arms as well. With that done and out of the way, I could finally lay the airbrush aside and switch to my favorite tools, brushes. Like I said, I wanted to try the quick paint way of painting this time. As the results, all these amazing figure painter posts are really awesome, especially considering the spent time. But I also don't want to buy new paints or products every time something new hits the market for two reasons. First, I am kind of stingy, and second, I just don't have the space to store all these products and paints. So I thought there must be a way to try this type of painting with the paints I have here in my hobby room. So what did I do? I mixed me the quick paint base coat out of a regular model color paint by diluting it with 2 drops of flow improver to break the tension so the mix flows better, 3 drops of matte varnish to knock down any shine and to avoid tight marks when the paint dries, and 2 drops of tap water. This was then mixed well and I checked the opacity on my paper towel. It should be thin enough so the pre-shading can still shine through, but thicker than a glaze. This mix was then applied over the jacket of the first figure like a filter. I made sure the paint is applied as equal as possible with no pooling paint in crevices or deeper spots. Like this layer only changed the color of the jacket, but not the light-shadow ratio. The pre-shading was still visible and darker spots stayed darker. And I worked in small sections because this heavily diluted paint dried pretty fast and I could avoid hard edges like this. I also tried to work as accurate as possible and only paint the jacket itself, but not the surrounding details like belts or the elbow pads, because these were supposed to stay clean and receive their specific paints later. To not end up with 3 completely same looking uniforms and bring in some variation, I used this mix only for some uniform parts, like 2 jackets on 2 guys and the pants on this one. For the other uniform parts, I used paints that were matching in color and diluted them the same way I did it on the first mix. And these were then applied just like the first one, as equal and thorough as possible. To avoid flooding the figure, I unloaded my brush on a paper towel before touching the figure every time I took new paint, so I had more control over the application. The equipment and parts like shoulder and ammunition bags, shovel holders and canteens, belts and backpacks were also all painted with different paints diluted in the same ratio to bring in variation, making the figures more interesting. Of course, I used paints here that were matching by looking at reference pictures I took in museums over the last years. For the reinforced knee and elbow pads, reinforced pockets and the strings around the leg bags, I used a matching green tone. But I here used some older AK 2nd gen paints which were thinner compared to the model colors or AK 3rd gens. So I had to add 5 drops of paint to the mix instead of 3. But at this time I had a good feeling already for the needed opacity, so that wasn't really a problem. As all paratroopers were wearing gloves, I could base coat them here as well already. This was somehow cool because painting gloves will be faster and easier than painting skin tones, but on the other side, naked hands on at least one figure would have added some more variation. But this was totally my fault as I chose the figures and I could have thought about this in advance. With all or at least the most important parts base coated with their respective base colors, it was time to bring in the shadows. For that I mixed me a very thin dark brown wash, maybe slightly thinner than I would mix a glaze, and applied this over the complete base coated areas. I here wanted the wash to pool in deeper spots and crevices, so they get significant darker. Another benefit was that this wash acted like a filter and slightly unified all the different base paints I used before, making the figure's surfaces look smoother. And after the first application dried, what happened pretty fast because of the heavy thinning, I applied additional layers until I was satisfied with the effect. I was pretty happy with how the shadows looked after the wash dried completely. Even the smaller crevices, like on the ammunition pouches and the jacket zippers, got emphasized here. All the fine lines on the canteen cover. I wanted to make seams and outlines look stronger. So I used an almost black paint, diluted with retarder in equal parts, and repainted all seams with it or outlined details like pockets or buttons. This always makes uniforms look sharper and more defined, breaking large surfaces into smaller sections. And the surface details like pockets stand out more from the monotonous looking uniform. After the dark wash, the whole figures were in the shadow level and looked very dark and messy. So I had to bring back some light by painting highlights. I used the respective base paint I painted the individual parts with and lightened it up with AK's buff, a bright yellowish beige. With that mix I started to paint the areas that would receive at least some light, so basically almost everything except the shadow areas. My thinning medium was matte varnish from now on the whole time because it dries super fast and super matte obviously. And like I said, I used this specific highlight mix on every part. I used this base paint on for the initial first layer, like the side back in this case. After the first highlight, I lightened up the mix up with more buff and started to paint a second highlight. This brighter mix was applied onto the most raised and therefore to light exposed areas like the tips of crevices. I also used it to paint the edges of surface details like pocket lids. That helped to make these parts stand out more, especially after the dark outlining I made before adding the highlights. Because the two highlight paints brought in a strong contrast, I wanted to knock that down a bit and unify the uniform parts. And for that I used the good old glazing. I used the base paint, diluted it with matte varnish to a glaze-like consistency and painted this over the whole part. I made sure that this mix isn't pooling in deeper spots and that I applied it equally, so it's not covering the shadows completely. But I tried to concentrate this glaze slightly more into the shadows as they were really dark compared to the highlighted areas. And I varied the consistency of the glaze by adding more or less matte varnish, depending on how strong the shadows came out in specific areas or how much I wanted to knock them down. And like I said, I had to repeat these steps on every part. I used a different base paint. Paint two highlights with a lightened up base paint and unify the result with glazes. When painting these glazes, I made sure to unload the brush before touching the figure, so I didn't flood the surface with the paint. And like this I had more control over the amount of applied paint and could build up the effect in several thin layers, and that's always better than ruining everything with one too thick layer. Looking back, choosing that much different base colors for sure wasn't helpful in my attempt to be fast, but on the other hand, making all these steps wasn't that time consuming and split the figures in more sections, what was helpful to keep my motivation high. With the uniforms done, my favorite part began, painting details and accessories. The map piece was base painted with a whitish paint as a foundation for the upcoming decal. I decided on a map decal here because I couldn't paint a good looking map freehand and I didn't want to ruin the figure with a bad looking map. These troopers were neutral because they had no sculpted patches, So I added some 80-second airborne patches I had in my stash for decades. Unfortunately, they showed their age and looked pretty bad. So I decided to use them as template and partly repainted the worst areas. I started with the red area, carefully letting the brush follow the decal with a steady hand. Wherever I found it necessary, I also repainted the other areas with the corresponding paints. So I ended up with these not perfect looking but recognizable patches, and with their painted surface they integrated much better into the painted uniforms compared to naked decals, at least in my eyes. The wooden parts of the weapons were base painted with a medium dark brown. With almost black paint I applied some kind of wood grain with lines as fine as I could paint them. On top of the wood grain I made several glazes in matching brown tones to integrate the grain into the surfaces and match the look of the original weapons as close as for me possible. The metal parts of the weapons, as well as all other metal parts, were base painted with an almost black paint, followed by a wash with black ink by AK, and finished with my fancy graphite pen or pencil, highlighting the edges or areas that could be more shiny because of regular use. And that's the weapons with the finished wooden and metal parts. And now I could finally glue them into place. I also use these quick paint mixes to base paint the civilian figure's pants and sleeveless sweater, or polunder as we call it. And here I am adding the shadows with the dark mix, making sure the mix is pooling in the deeper spots and crevices. The sweater had a great sculpted fabric pattern, and this dark mix really helped to emphasize the deeper spots and bring in some depth. The first highlight was slightly lighter than the base coat, and I repainted all areas that would receive some light and therefore should be lighter. Just like I did it on the Paratroopers, but with different paints. A second highlight was applied onto the more raised areas, like tips of folds or details like seams, pockets or the holes, to make them stand out more and add more contrast. This paint was partly applied by stippling to add some more texture to the pants and make the highlights look more irregular. And because I felt the pants were still lacking contrast, I added a third highlight with lighter paint, very sparingly and in small amount, only applied to the most raised areas and around details by stippling to create more texture and only add a few bright spots. And to unify shadows and highlights, I made a glaze with the base paint. I here again made sure that the glaze was applied as an even layer without pooling paint in crevices, so it's not covering the shadows there. To work out the highlights of the polunder, I used the good old dry brushing. This was just perfect to work out the amazing texture of the sweater and brighten up only the raised fabric pattern. So with a very dry brush I applied the first highlight with a lightened up version of the base paint, but of course only into the brighter areas. And with a second lighter paint I treated the more raised and therefore to light exposed areas and made them brighter. And again, I love the look of this sweater. After base painting the shirt with a whitish mix, I added the shadows with a thin medium grey wash. Painted highlights with pure white. And unified everything with the glaze with the base paint. The last thing I had to do on this arm and headless guy was to paint the remaining details like belts, the resistance armband and ammunition bags. With the body painted completely, I could glue the arms in place, so I had this sometimes messy job out of the way before I started to paint the skin tones. I just hated to glue completely painted parts together with shiny super glue getting squeezed out of the gaps. And with all figures painted, I could now start the most thrilling and nervous-making chapter, skin tones. I first started to experiment with new paints like I often do, but after I couldn't achieve satisfying results, I ended up with the same approach I used on the tank crew I painted recently. So let's give me a quick summary what I did. I started with a very strong diluted base coat applied as equal as possible. A dry brush was used to remove excess paint from the deeper spots like the eyes. The paint was like before, that thin that the pre-shading still shines through slightly. Next I added the shadows with a wash with a darker shadow paint, and I here again made sure that it was pooling in the deeper spots without overdoing it with the amount of applied wash. Because this wash again had this filter effect and made the whole skin tone significantly darker, I used the dark base paint again to repaint all areas that wouldn't be in the shadowed areas and receive at least some light. Like this, I wanted to avoid a too strong contrast like on the uniforms. To further reduce the contrast and integrate the shadows into the skin tones, I used the same paint and applied it very thin by stippling into the shadows and used a soft dry brush to blend these. The dry brush reduces the brush strokes and makes the paint look smoother and more regular. I started to apply the first highlight paint and with that painted the more raised and to light exposed areas. And because this first highlight paint was just slightly lighter, the painted area was pretty large. The whole time I made sure to unload the brush on my glove so I wasn't flooding the face when touching it. As the second highlight obviously was lighter than the first, the painted area became smaller and the paint even more diluted, so it's less covering and more translucent. With this lighter mix I painted the more exposed areas like back of the nose, forehead, upper cheeks and chin. I also used it even more diluted to blend over the shadows again, to reduce the contrast and make the faces smoother. Then came the stage where I tried out new ways and paints for my skin tone approach, ending up unsatisfied. So I covered my unsuccessful tries with a bright skin tone in several thin layers as a foundation to continue from now on, like I did it on my tank crew from the last project. So this light skin tone could be your starting point, and as this bright face needed more darker tones in the shadowed area, I mixed me a medium dark flashy shadow paint. This was then applied into all areas that would be at least a bit darker, like the lower cheeks, under the eyes, sides of the nose or under the chin. I used retarder to dilute the paints so they stay workable longer and I can blend the edges smooth with a soft dry brush. Next I added an even darker shadow mix into the deepest and darkest areas, blending it into the medium shadows with my dry blending brush. As the paint became darker, the painted areas became smaller, so only the darkest areas were painted here. And this paint is also great for painting the lips, as it's not too pink, so the lips look more fleshy and less doll-like. After adding the shadows, I worked my way through the highlights and I started with adding the first highlight into the areas that would receive at least some light because they were more raised than the rest. I painted this tone to the edges of the shadows and then blended it into them, so I ended up with smooth transitions. Next I added the second highlight into the most exposed and therefore brightest areas, like the back of the nose, upper cheeks, forehead on the guy not wearing a helmet, and chins. This was blended into the first highlight, as again, the brighter the paint became, the smaller the painted areas were. And in general, every following shadow or highlight paint was applied more diluted than the layer before, so it's more translucent, not covering the previous work. The faces were finished with a 5 o'clock or bearded shadow. This bluish black mix was applied super thin in several layers, heavily diluted with retarder. It's always better working in thin layers, building up the effect, than adding one too thick layer, overdoing it. I stippled the mix into the face and then used my blending brush to smoothen it out. This mix is also great to enhance the shadows in the neck area and under the hairline as a transition between hair and skin. And yeah, after a troubled start I ended up with skin tones I at least could live with and move on. The naked arms of the Resistance fighter were painted with the same paints in the same order when I worked on the faces. I now quickly painted the rest of the heads like helmets, camo nettings or the black hair of the Resistance guy. And then reached the point where the heads were ready for painting the eyes. I here used my tested and proven method of using dark brown oil paint. Place a dot into the eye and use a thinner moistened brush to rework size and shape, or remove it completely and start over again. Super easy. Several people told me to try using a sharp toothpick to place the oil paint instead of a fine brush. So I grabbed me one of the sharpest picks I could find and tried it, and it worked really well. So I recommend you try this too. The time the eyes needed to dry, I spent weathering the figures. To integrate them optically to the diorama, I used the same enamels and pigments I used there and added some light dirt and mud traces to the boots and uniforms. As good as they were looking clean, these are combatants and should be at least slightly dirty. With all parts dry and done, I could finally glue the heads in place and for the first time see how they look together. After setting the final positions, I glued the figures into the diorama and leveled them to the ground with real earth without trademark, so they weren't floating, and fixed everything with sand and ballistries by VMS. The last thing I had to do after the earth was dry was to integrate it into the diorama, again with the same enamels I used on the diorama back in the days and earlier on the figures. And with that, we finally made it. I am super happy with the result on these figures. I again learned a lot, especially on painting with thinned down paints as a foundation. The actual working time on these figures was shorter than I expected, especially with all the details and accessories the paratroopers had. What delayed my process was more related to the summer weather and the resulting lack of motivation to sit at the workbench. But this way of painting figures is more than an alternative way to pre-coloring, for example, so I guess I will try to improve it even further. And I am happy that I seem to have found my standard approach for painting skin tones. I am thinking about putting this together in a dedicated, clean video if this would be interesting for you. Last but not least, I hope you like the diorama now, filled up with more figures. I think the newly painted paras integrate really nicely into the scene with the older ones. If you made it until here, thank you very much for watching. I hope my video was interesting to watch and maybe even helpful and you could learn a thing or two. If you like what you saw, I would be very happy if you support me by subscribing, and I am curious to read your feedback and thoughts to these figures. Und nein, das gibt es nicht auch auf Deutsch. So, enough said for today. Thanks again for watching. Good luck for your figure painting tries. Stay safe and until the next time.